She stood up in first class, and with a few sharp words, shattered the silence and every assumption around her. But what happened next stunned the entire plane. First, let's go back to the beginning. The cold, recirculated air felt sharper against Aaliyah's skin as she sat rigid in her seat, willing her hands to stillness. The plane's engines thrummed beneath her, a low, ceaseless vibration that somehow amplified the silence now pulsing between her and the rows around her. She stared at the screen of her tablet, its brightness glaring against her vision, but the words had blurred into meaninglessness. The echo of Deborah Langston's voice, so casual, so condescending, clung to her like a stain. Aaliyah could feel the shift in the cabin's atmosphere. People weren't discreet. They never were in moments like this. The man in the business suit 2 rows ahead adjusted his tie and shot her a glance from beneath his glasses. A woman in pearls across the aisle leaned toward her husband, whispering behind manicured fingers, eyes flicking to Aaliyah with poorly masked curiosity. Even the flight attendant at the front, who had smiled warmly at Aaliyah upon boarding, now seemed to hesitate, glancing in her direction as though weighing some invisible scale of belonging. Aaliyah exhaled slowly through her nose, a breath both measured and defensive, as if bracing herself against the invisible pressure closing in. The plane was a capsule 30,000 feet in the air, and somehow it still wasn't high enough to escape the gravity of judgment. It wasn't the first time, and she knew it wouldn't be the last. But every time it happened, it cut a little deeper. Not because she doubted herself, but because she had hoped, foolishly, that she wouldn't have to fight for her place today. Her fingers curled tighter around the armrest, nails pressing crescents into the leather. A memory flashed, her father's voice, firm and unyielding as he pinned another medal to his army uniform, telling her, "The world will see your skin before it sees your soul. Let them. Then show them everything they missed." The anger inside her was not a storm, wild, consuming. It was a forge, hot, deliberate, shaping something stronger. She would not shrink. She would not explain herself to small minds that asked small questions. Aaliyah lifted her chin by an inch, squared her shoulders, and returned her gaze to her tablet. She flipped the screen to black and simply stared at her reflection, letting the cool fire in her eyes steady her pulse. The real turbulence had indeed begun. But it wasn't the kind that shook the cabin. It was the kind that shifted the ground beneath those who had dared to underestimate her. The minutes oozed by with excruciating slowness, each second dragging a heavier chain of awareness around Aaliyah's body. The discomfort wasn't loud or violent. It was quieter, more insidious, the way mold creeps behind paint, unseen but corrosive. Every whisper that died against a cupped hand, every sidelong glance quickly averted when she turned her head, deepened the isolation pressing in from all sides. She was no stranger to rooms like this, rooms filled not with shouting but with a silence thick enough to suffocate. The low murmur of conversation, the gentle clink of ice against glass, the perfumed breeze as a flight attendant hurried past. It all felt distant, distorted, as if she were wrapped in invisible cellophane, set apart from the rest. As the man in khakis and a monogrammed polo shirt strolled past on his way to the restroom, he let out a short laugh. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't even private. It was the kind of laugh designed to diminish, to remind, to relegate. Aaliyah didn't flinch, but the sound sliced through her thoughts like a scalpel. Her mind betrayed her then, unspooling memories she had folded away long ago. Being 13 years old, shadowed by security in a designer boutique while her white classmates roamed free, draped in dresses they couldn't afford. Submitting an essay judged too good to be her own work. Her guidance counselor suggesting she tone it down a little to seem more authentic. Sitting silent in school assemblies as awards passed her by in favor of students who worked half as hard but fit the picture better. Each recollection burned through her chest like acid, stripping away the careful layers of composure she had built over years of practice. And then, as if summoned by the old ache, her mother's voice floated up, soft but immovable. "You'll have to work twice as hard, baby. And even then, some folks will act like you stole your place." It hadn't been a warning. It had been a prophecy. A sharp electronic ding shattered her spiral, the seatbelt sign flicking off with a hollow chime. The plane shifted slightly as it cruised higher, but Aaliyah remained motionless, rooted not by fear of turbulence, but by the gravity of unseen eyes. It had never been about the plush leather seat beneath her, nor the glass of water in her cup holder, nor the number on her ticket. It was about the coded message in Deborah's voice, the complicit silence of her fellow passengers, the ancient script being replayed yet again. "You don't belong here." But something shifted deep within Aaliyah, slow but certain, a stubborn ember refusing to be snuffed out. Pain and fury braided together, tightening into resolve. She wasn't a guest here. She wasn't borrowing space. She was a force they were about to reckon with, and she would not sit quietly and disappear. Not today. The low clatter of meal trays rolling down the aisle barely pierced the thick current of unspoken tension weaving through first class. As the cart neared her row, a flight attendant paused, tray in hand, eyes flickering with uncertainty. Her smile strained at the corners, professional but nervous. "I'm sorry, miss, but could I please see your boarding pass?" she asked, her voice pitched low as if trying not to disturb the delicate balance of politeness that had already been shattered. Aaliyah inhaled deliberately, steadying herself against the fresh wave of humiliation clawing at the edge of her composure. Without a word, she reached into the seat pocket and retrieved her pass, placing it carefully into the attendant's hand with fingers that did not tremble. The woman scanned it once, frowned slightly, scanned it again. The faintest bloom of color rose on her cheeks as she realized her mistake, realized what the request itself had revealed, not about Aaliyah, but about everyone else. "No problem at all, ma'am. Thank you," the attendant murmured, the words spilling out quickly, almost tripping over themselves in her rush to retreat. Aaliyah returned the boarding pass to its place, her movements precise, almost ritualistic, like someone setting down the final piece of an argument. She unfolded her napkin and laid it across her lap, smoothing the fabric with slow deliberation. The watching eyes, the sidelong glances, the faux casual whispers, had sharpened now into focused, waiting silence. She could have left it there. She could have stewed quietly, pretending not to notice the hasty justifications being built in every mind around her. But she was tired of swallowing her dignity just to preserve someone else's comfort. Rising from her seat, she allowed herself a beat of stillness, long enough to command the full attention of every soul in that cabin. "For anyone still wondering," she began, her voice carrying not through volume but through absolute clarity, "I'm here because I graduated from Harvard at 20. The air seemed to crystallize, the usual drone of the plane's engines receding into the background as each word cut cleanly through the cabin's collective pretense. "I'm now the youngest partner at my law firm, Monroe and Chase," she continued, each syllable measured, deliberate, each fact striking with the precision of a hammer against glass. "I paid for this seat, in cash, twice over if I needed to." She let the words hang there, a challenge and a benediction both. Then, just slightly, she turned her head and offered a smile so warm, so devastatingly gracious, it could only be described as merciful. "But thank you for reminding me why I earned every bit of this." The effect was instant and electric. A hush blanketed the cabin, deeper than any silence that had come before. The whispered gossip ceased mid-breath. The businessman who had laughed earlier fidgeted with his watch, eyes locked on the carpet. Deborah Langston, the woman whose voice had first pierced the quiet, now sat frozen, her cheeks flushed an angry, helpless red, her eyes glued to the designer handbag in her lap, as if it might offer a place to hide. Aaliyah remained standing for a heartbeat longer, not in defiance, but in ownership of her seat, her worth, her story. Then she lowered herself back into her chair, her dignity intact, her silence heavier and more commanding than any shouted argument could have been. The change in the cabin was so subtle at first it could have been missed, but for those who had been holding their breath, it was seismic. It wasn't just the absence of whispers. It was a shift in gravity, a recalibration of the silent, invisible lines that had been drawn between seats, between people. 2 rows ahead, a man in a tailored gray blazer, who had earlier glanced at Aaliyah with skeptical eyes, now gave her a slow, deliberate nod. There was no awkwardness in it, no hesitation, just a quiet offering of respect. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. The acknowledgement was in the gesture itself, heavy with meaning. Across the aisle, an older black woman dabbed discreetly at the corners of her eyes with a tissue, her lips moving in a silent "thank you" that crossed the space between them like a bridge. There was a weight behind that look, a shared history, an invisible thread binding them across generations. Aaliyah met her gaze and gave a small, private smile in return, an exchange more profound than any applause could have been. The flight attendant, who had earlier fumbled through the boarding pass request, returned during the meal service, slipping a small, elegant dessert onto Aaliyah's tray without a word. As she leaned in, she whispered quickly, almost reverently, "You're an inspiration," before moving on, her shoulders a little straighter, as if some invisible burden had been lifted from them both. Aaliyah sat back in her seat, the chocolate tart untouched for the moment, feeling her pulse thrumming in her ears. But it wasn't the erratic, defensive rhythm of anger. It was a steady, thunderous beat of something far stronger. Power, not given, not borrowed, but claimed. The plane began its slow, methodical descent, the captain's voice crackling overhead with final instructions. As the wheels touched down and the brakes engaged with a muted roar, the passengers jostled and shifted, eager to disembark. Deborah Langston stood awkwardly in the narrow aisle, clutching her handbag like a lifeline. She cast a glance toward Aaliyah, an awkward, faltering thing, laced with something that might have been guilt, might have been shame. But Aaliyah did not look away, nor did she grant the moment more significance than it deserved. She didn't need Deborah's apology. She had never needed it. Because validation, she realized, was a currency far cheaper than the self-worth she had earned, paid for with years of excellence, resilience, and defiance against the odds. As the cabin emptied and the rows slowly cleared, Aaliyah remained seated for a breath longer, savoring the stillness. She had spoken her truth, not for approval, not for applause, but because it demanded to be spoken. She had claimed her place, here in this seat, in this world, and by doing so, she had cracked something wider open than the thin, stagnant air of the airplane cabin. Because sometimes, the most powerful turbulence doesn't shake metal wings or jostle overhead bins. It shakes people. It shakes assumptions. It shakes the very air around those who dared to believe they could cage someone else's worth. And in that moment, Aaliyah Monroe soared higher than any plane could ever take her.